I never thought my 82-year-old heart could beat this fast again. At least, not for this reason. The moment his hand brushed mine, a strange chill ran up my arm, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. His eyes, blue, clear, too kind for what I would soon learn, met mine over the rim of his glass. My father's voice carried across the mahogany dining table in that booming way of his. "Margaret," Dad said, his face splitting into a proud grin. "This is Thomas Avery, my business partner. And I might add, a man I think would make you very happy." I smiled politely, my cheeks warm, my mind racing. Dad had been hinting for weeks that he wanted me to meet someone. But I didn't expect him to mean a rich widower who had that old money confidence in his posture. He looked like a man who had never waited in a grocery line in his life. He leaned forward, his tailored navy suit creasing just enough to suggest it had been custom-made for his frame. "Your father tells me you're retired from teaching." He nodded. 35 years in elementary education. Second grade was my specialty. "Ah," he said with the kind of admiration that made me almost blush. "Patience and wisdom, a rare combination." Dad chuckled, obviously pleased with how the introduction was going. He had never quite stopped being the deal-maker, even after stepping back from his real estate empire. And now, apparently, I was his next project. But as Thomas continued speaking, I caught a flicker of movement near the doorway. My sister Elaine stepped in late as always. She was the opposite of me in almost every way. Brunette where I was blonde, city chic where I was small-town comfortable. Her red lipstick caught the light as she flashed her smile at Dad, then at me, and then finally at Thomas. And something in that smile made my stomach drop. It wasn't just polite. It wasn't just friendly. It was knowing. Thomas's voice faltered for the briefest second, his gaze flicking toward her before returning to me. Elaine took her seat as if she hadn't just altered the entire temperature of the room. I tried to focus on the conversation, but I couldn't shake the subtle current passing between them, like they were speaking a language without words. After dessert, when Dad excused himself to take a phone call, I caught it again, this almost imperceptible glance. And then, as Thomas stood to leave, he placed his hand lightly on my shoulder and said, "It was wonderful to meet you, Margaret. I hope we see each other again soon." But when he turned, his eyes, those impossibly calm blue eyes, locked on Elaine for just a second too long. And her smile. God help me, her smile deepened. My father re-entered the room, completely oblivious, and started talking about arranging a family lunch the following weekend so we could all get better acquainted. I excused myself, claiming I needed to find my reading glasses. In reality, I stood in the hallway, one hand against the wall, my breath short, because in that moment I knew something was going on between my sister and the man my father had just tried to matchmake me with. And I wasn't sure which betrayal hurt worse, the possibility that she was hiding it from me, or that she might actually be in love with him. Still, I told myself it could all be in my head. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just my imagination. But then, 3 nights later, I saw something that ripped away any doubt. I had gone into town for groceries, and as I walked past the little coffee shop near Main Street, I froze. There they were, Thomas and Elaine, sitting far too close. Her hand was on his knee, and his was cupping her face like she was the only woman in the world. Elaine's laughter floated through the glass as he leaned in and kissed her. I stood there, clutching my grocery bag, the world tilting on its axis. My father's perfect match was my sister's secret lover. And that was just the beginning. If you told me 2 months earlier that my father would be trying to matchmake me like some high school sophomore without a date to the dance, I would have laughed. But that was before he became obsessed with making sure I wasn't alone. It started on one of those sharp November mornings, when the leaves had mostly given up clinging to the trees and the wind carried that faint smell of wood smoke. I dropped by Dad's house. He still lived in the big colonial he'd bought when I was 10, to bring him homemade apple pie. He was in the kitchen, standing over the counter with a yellow legal pad, writing in that blocky handwriting that looked more like it belonged on an architectural blueprint than a grocery list. "Morning, Dad," I said, setting the pie on the counter. You're working early. He looked up, grinning. Margaret, I've been thinking. That was my first warning sign. My father thinking meant trouble for someone. You've been on your own too long, he said, like it was an indisputable fact. A good man would do you some good. Someone who can keep you company, take you to dinner, maybe travel with you. Life's too short to spend your golden years alone. I rolled my eyes. I'm fine, Dad. I have my garden, my books, and my friends at church. He waved that off. Friends don't hold your hand on the porch at night, Maggie. I laughed. And here I thought you'd given up meddling after Elaine's last relationship disaster. He smirked but didn't deny it. Elaine's string of failed romances was legendary in the family. Always some man who was flashy and charming but never stuck around. That's when he leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. I know someone perfect for you. Groaned. Dad. Hear me out, he said. His tone shifting into the same one he used when convincing investors to buy into his real estate projects. Thomas Avery. You've probably heard me mention him, my business partner in the development firm. His wife passed away 3 years ago. Solid man, old school manners, smart as hell. And he's, let me guess, I cut in. Rich. He grinned like a schoolboy caught sneaking cookies. Well, he's comfortable. I'm not saying that's why you should be interested, but it wouldn't hurt. You deserve to be treated well. I sighed, knowing my father well enough to realize that refusing would only make him push harder. Fine, I said, but no setups. If I meet him, it has to be casual. Done, he said too quickly. Looking back, I realized the wheels were already turning in his mind. That casual meeting at his house 2 weeks later was anything but accidental. The first time I heard Thomas Avery's name, it was in passing years ago, when Dad came home from a meeting talking about a brilliant mind he was lucky to work with. I'd never met the man because their business world was completely separate from mine. But in the weeks leading up to our dinner, Dad couldn't stop mentioning him. Thomas is back from Europe, he'd say over the phone. Thomas just closed a huge deal. Thomas is joining us for dinner next weekend. It was relentless. And yet, I didn't think much of it, until Elaine got wind of it. We were sitting in my kitchen one afternoon, sipping tea while the late autumn light slanted through the window. She was scrolling through her phone when I mentioned Dad's plan. She froze for half a second, so quick I almost missed it, and then smiled. Oh, this Thomas must be something special if Dad thinks he's perfect for you. Her tone was light, but I knew Elaine. That pause, that little shift in her voice meant something. You know him? Yes. She shrugged, not meeting my eyes. I've heard of him. Dad talks about him a lot. Must be a big deal in their business. I let it drop, not wanting to read too much into it. But now, looking back, I wonder if that was the moment she realized she had a problem. The night of the dinner, I dressed conservatively. A cream cardigan, navy skirt, pearl earrings. I wasn't there to impress anyone. This was for Dad, not me. Thomas was charming, I'll give him that. He asked about my life, my students, the places I'd traveled. He listened, really listened, which is rare these days. But every so often, I'd catch Elaine watching him, her eyes sharp and unreadable. When she arrived late and made that first electric eye contact with him, I didn't understand it. I just felt it like a low hum under the skin. After he left that night, Dad clapped me on the shoulder. See, didn't I tell you? He's a good man, Maggie. I nodded, forcing a smile. He seems nice. But the truth was, something about it didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it then. That's why, 3 days later, when I stopped by the coffee shop and saw Thomas's hand on Elaine's knee, it didn't shock me as much as it should have. What shocked me was that my sister, my own flesh and blood, looked happier in that moment than I'd seen her in years. And I had no idea what to do with that. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elaine leaning across that little cafe table, her hand cupping Thomas's cheek like they'd been lovers for years. By morning, the kettle had whistled twice before I remembered to pour the water over my tea. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the steam curling from my mug, trying to think logically. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they were just friendly. Maybe he was comforting her. Maybe I was reading too much into body language. But the truth clung to me like the damp November fog outside. That wasn't friendly. That was intimate. I decided not to tell Dad. Not yet. His heart wasn't as strong as it used to be, and the last thing I wanted was to shock him into the hospital. But Elaine, I had to speak to her. I called her mid-morning. Want to come over for lunch? I made that chicken salad you like. There was a pause on the line, slight, but enough for me to notice. Sure, she said finally. I'll be there around 1. When she arrived, she breezed into my kitchen like nothing was wrong. She was wearing a cream sweater dress, her hair perfectly blown out, smelling faintly of the kind of perfume that doesn't come from a drugstore. We sat down, and I decided to take the roundabout approach. I saw Thomas the other day, I said casually, spearing a grape from my salad. Her fork froze midair. Oh, yes, I said, watching her face. In town. She set her fork down slowly. And I leaned back in my chair. And he seemed friendly. With the person he was with. Elaine's lips curved into something between a smirk and a warning. Margaret, you've always had an overactive imagination. Maybe that's from reading too many mystery novels. It wasn't my imagination, I said softly. I saw his hand on your knee. Her eyes flashed then, just for a second before she masked it with a laugh. Oh please. We've known each other for a while. He's Dad's business partner, remember? We've been to plenty of events together. Sometimes people touch. It doesn't mean anything. She picked up her fork again, as if the matter was settled. But my stomach churned. She was lying, I could feel it in my bones. I decided to test her. Dad really seems to like him. Thinks he'd be a good match for me. The fork paused again. A shadow flickered across her face before she forced a bright smile. Well, that's sweet. But you're too smart to let Dad play matchmaker, right? She left soon after, claiming she had errands to run. I stood at my kitchen window, watching her back out of my driveway, my fingers tight around my teacup. She hadn't denied it. She'd danced around it, twisted it, but she hadn't denied it. 2 days later, Dad invited me to a small gathering at his house. Just a few close friends. When I arrived, the living room was already full of murmured conversation and the clink of glasses. I spotted Thomas near the fireplace, looking sharp in a charcoal blazer. He was speaking to a small group, his expression relaxed, until he saw Elaine walk in. It was like the air shifted. His smile softened, his stance straightened, and for just a fraction of a second they locked eyes. I saw it. And I wasn't the only one. Dad's oldest friend, Gloria, sharp-eyed and never one to hold her tongue, leaned toward me and whispered, "They seem awfully close, don't they?" I turned to look at her. "You think so too?" Gloria gave me a knowing nod. Honey, I've been to enough weddings and divorces to recognize that look. Before I could answer, Dad appeared beside us, grinning. "Maggie, there you are. Thomas has been asking about you all evening." And just like that, I was swept into Thomas's orbit again. Polite conversation, warm smiles, but now every word felt like a performance. I kept glancing toward Elaine, who mingled with the guests like nothing was amiss. Halfway through the night, I excused myself to the powder room. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard muffled voices coming from Dad's study. The door was cracked open just an inch. I shouldn't have stopped. I shouldn't have listened. But I did. Elaine's voice, low, tense. "You need to tell her before Dad pushes this any further." Thomas's reply, equally quiet but firm. "Not yet. She can't know. Not like this." My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Elaine hissed something I couldn't make out, and then there was silence, followed by the sound of a kiss. I stumbled back a step, my palm pressed to my mouth. And that's when the door creaked open. Thomas stood there, his eyes meeting mine. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but cold. "We need to talk." For a second I couldn't move. Thomas stood in the doorway of Dad's study, blocking my view of Elaine, his frame casting a shadow across the hall. His tone was soft, almost coaxing, but there was an edge to it, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Margaret," he repeated, "let's step outside." I glanced past him, catching just the barest flicker of movement. Elaine, smoothing her hair, eyes averted. She didn't say a word. Thomas gestured toward the side porch. "Please." My body obeyed before my mind caught up. The crisp night air hit me like a slap as we stepped outside. The porch light cast us both in pale yellow, and I noticed how his hands stayed in his pockets, his voice measured. "I'm sorry you overheard," he began. "But you're misunderstanding what you think you saw or heard." I folded my arms. "Really?" "Because I think I heard my sister telling you to confess before Dad pushes this any further. And then I think I heard you kissing her." He shook his head, his expression almost pitying. "Elaine and we've been friends for a while. She's been going through some personal struggles. That kiss wasn't what you think. It was comfort, nothing more." I let out a bitter laugh. "You expect me to believe you kiss women you're not involved with in my father's study while his guests are down the hall?" He didn't flinch. "I expect you to believe that I care about your family. Your father values our partnership, and I'd hate for you to create unnecessary tension between us over a misinterpretation." The implication was clear. Don't make trouble. "Misinterpretation," I repeated, my voice low. "I saw the way you looked at her the first night we met. I saw the coffee shop. That's not nothing, Mr. Avery." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Irritation. "Margaret, you're an intelligent woman. Surely you know that stirring up rumors could cause irreparable damage. To your father, to Elaine, even to yourself." There it was again, that subtle shift from charm to warning. Before I could respond, the sliding door behind us opened and Dad stepped out, smiling like the host he was. "You two hiding out here? Come back in, everyone's asking where you've gone." Thomas's mask slipped seamlessly back into place. "We were just talking about the garden," he said smoothly. "Margaret has quite the green thumb." Dad chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder, completely unaware that the man he was praising had just threatened me in the most polite way possible. The rest of the evening was a blur. I kept my distance from both Thomas and Elaine, plastering on the kind of smile you wear when you're seconds from breaking. When the guests began leaving, I told Dad I wasn't feeling well and headed home. Once inside my little bungalow, I leaned against the door, my pulse still racing. I'd spent my life teaching children how to tell the truth, how to be kind, how to respect others. And here I was, being treated like I was too naive to see the truth right in front of me. But the thing about living more than 8 decades is you learn that silence can be more powerful than shouting. And I wasn't ready to make my move. Not yet. The next morning I was in the kitchen when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Elaine. "We need to talk. Alone. Lunch at Bella's, 1 p.m. Bella's was her favorite bistro. Quiet, upscale, the kind of place where you could say something scandalous and no one would overhear. When I arrived, she was already seated by the window, a glass of white wine in front of her even though it was barely past noon. She looked tired, but when she saw me she smiled, a brittle, strained thing. "I suppose you've already made up your mind about me," she said as I sat down. "I saw enough to form an opinion," I replied evenly. She let out a slow breath. "Margaret, Thomas and it's complicated. Didn't start the way you think. And it's not what Dad thinks either." "Then why hide it?" She hesitated, swirling her wine. "Because if Dad knew, it would ruin everything. And not just for me." There was something in her tone, something almost desperate, that made me pause. Before I could press her, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and went pale. Without a word, she slid the phone across the table toward me. It was a message from an unknown number. The text read, "If you don't tell her today, I will." My stomach dropped. Elaine whispered, "He's losing patience, Margaret. And when Thomas loses patience." She trailed off, her eyes darting to the window. and I realized for the first time that my sister was afraid. I left Bella's with more questions than answers. Elaine's fear wasn't an act, that much I knew. I'd seen her pull stunts in the past to manipulate people, but this wasn't the same. This was something raw. As I walked home through the crisp afternoon air, I replayed her words. When Thomas loses patience. That wasn't the kind of warning you tossed around lightly. If Thomas Avery thought he could intimidate me into silence, he'd underestimated one very important fact. 82 years of living means I've seen men like him before. And I've outlasted every single one. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, a cup of chamomile tea in hand. I typed Thomas Avery Real Estate into the search bar. The first pages were glossy. News articles praising his developments, smiling photographs at ribbon cuttings. But buried deeper, I found small-town reports from 10-15 years ago. Words like zoning violation, eminent domain disputes, and mysterious buyouts started to pop up. In each case, the deals always ended in his favor. I jotted notes in a small spiral notebook, the kind I used to keep lesson plans in. Patterns emerged. Thomas didn't just do business. He did business in a way that left people indebted, cornered, or silenced. At midnight, I stumbled across something that made my pulse quicken. A court filing from 8 years ago in another state, listing Thomas Avery as a party of interest in a fraud investigation. The case had been dropped, sealed in fact, but the name of the complainant stuck out. It was a woman. And she had the same last name as the development company Thomas now co-owned with my father. The next morning I decided to make a quiet move. I called Gloria, Dad's oldest friend, the same one who'd whispered to me at the party about Thomas and Elaine looking too close. Gloria had worked in the county records office for decades before retiring, and she still had friends on the inside. "Gloria," I said, "I need a favor." "Discreetly." "Discreet is my middle name, honey," she replied. "What's the dirt?" I told her enough to pique her interest, but not so much that it would come back to me too soon. She promised to poke around. By that afternoon she called me back. "You didn't hear this from me," she began. "But Thomas's first wife? She didn't just pass away. She drowned off their private dock. No witnesses. Police called it an accident, but..." She let the word hang. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. But her family didn't believe it. Tried to sue. Case got shut down fast. Money talks, Margaret. That evening, Dad invited me to dinner at his house again. He was in good spirits, completely unaware of the growing storm. Elaine was there too, pale and quiet, barely eating. Thomas was his usual smooth self, offering to top off my wine, asking about my garden. Halfway through dessert, Thomas leaned toward me just enough for only me to hear. "You've been doing some digging," he murmured, his eyes still fixed on his plate. My fork froze. "Excuse me. You're not as subtle as you think," he said softly. "And you're playing a dangerous game." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "So are you." For the first time he smiled. Not the warm, charming smile he wore for everyone else, but something colder. "Careful, Margaret. In business and in life, people who push too far tend to disappear." Later that night, as I was locking my front door, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Gloria. "You need to see this. Found something in the partnership records between your dad and Thomas. It's not just business. They're tied together in a way you won't like." Before I could reply, my porch light flickered, once, twice, then went out. In the darkness beyond my yard, I thought I saw movement. For a long, heavy second, I didn't move. The glow from my phone's screen was the only light left, and it felt like a spotlight in the dark. I locked the door quickly and pulled the curtain across the front window, my heart pounding against my ribs. The sensible part of me said it could have been a deer, or one of the neighbors' teenagers cutting across my yard. But another part, older, sharper, the part that had been watching faces and reading motives for 82 years, told me it wasn't an accident. Thomas Avery didn't make idle threats. I slipped my phone into my cardigan pocket and crossed to the back door, flipping the deadbolt. Every shadow in my kitchen seemed deeper than usual. I told myself I'd call Gloria back in the morning, when it wasn't so late, when my voice wouldn't betray the fear crawling up my throat. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. If Thomas thought he could scare me into silence, he'd forgotten one thing. I'd lived through worse. Heartbreak that could hollow a person out. Men like him were just another storm. I called Gloria at 8 a.m. sharp. "I want to see what you found," I told her. She hesitated. "Maggie, this isn't just a paper trail. If you have this information, you'll be holding something that could ruin him, and maybe your father too." My grip on the phone tightened. "Then I definitely need to see it." We met at her place. Small, tidy, with lace curtains and a view of the park. She spread the documents out on her dining table, her voice low. "Here's the thing," she said, pointing to a set of partnership records. "Your dad and Thomas aren't just business partners. 2 years ago they formed a holding company, Avery and Prescott Properties. And guess what? Your father signed over partial rights to some of his most valuable assets." I frowned. "Partial rights?" She nodded. "In the event of your father's death, those rights automatically transfer to Thomas." I stared at the paper. "Dad's will leaves the company to Elaine and me." Gloria's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not if this clause is triggered. Thomas would inherit controlling interest, and he could sell everything before you even knew what hit you." My stomach turned. This wasn't just about romance or betrayal anymore. This was about my father's entire legacy. I left Gloria's with copies of the documents tucked into my handbag. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove straight to Dad's office. He was at his desk, glasses perched low on his nose, reviewing blueprints. When he saw me, he smiled, but it faltered when he noticed the papers in my hand. "Margaret, what's all this?" I laid them out in front of him. "Why didn't you tell me about this clause?" He glanced at the page, then leaned back with a sigh. "Thomas suggested it. Said it was a way to protect the company if anything happened to me suddenly. He's a good man, Maggie. He's been a loyal partner." "Loyal?" asked, my voice rising. "Dad, he's manipulating you. Do you know what he's doing with Elaine? Do you even—" "Stop," Dad said sharply, his face hardening. "Whatever this is about, I don't want to hear it. Elaine's your sister, and Thomas is my friend. Don't stir up trouble." For a moment, it felt like I was 12 years old again, being scolded for speaking out of turn. But the stakes were too high to back down. "If you won't listen to me now," I said, gathering the papers, "then you'll listen when I have proof you can't ignore." That night, I started going through every public record I could find. Land deeds, zoning applications, court filings. It was tedious, but then found something. Property sale from just 3 months ago. The buyer, Avery and Prescott Properties. The seller, a family-owned farm. The sale price, suspiciously low. The name of the previous owner made my breath catch, because it wasn't just anyone. It was the same woman who'd tried to sue Thomas over his late wife's death. Before I could process it, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You have something that belongs to me. Bring it to the dock at Blackwater Lake tomorrow at 10 a.m., or your sister will regret it." I read that text 3 times, each word burning deeper into my mind. "Bring it to the dock at Blackwater Lake tomorrow at 10 a.m., or your sister will regret it." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. Thomas's fingerprints were all over this. His calculated phrasing, his choice of location. Blackwater Lake was private and remote. Perfect for business meetings. Or for making someone disappear. I set the phone down and sat back in my chair, letting the hum of my refrigerator fill the silence. If I didn't go, Elaine could be in danger. If I did go, I might be walking into something I couldn't walk out of. And that was when it hit me, maybe that was the point. Maybe Thomas was counting on me to be the protective big sister, to charge in without thinking. Well, he'd underestimated me again. At sunrise, I packed my tote bag, not just with the partnership documents, but with my phone fully charged, a small audio recorder, and a tiny camera my neighbor's grandson had once given me, just in case I wanted to catch the squirrels in the garden. It was small enough to fit inside my cardigan pocket, lens peeking out between the buttons. I also called Gloria. "I'm meeting Thomas at Blackwater Lake at 10. If you don't hear from me by noon, call the police. And tell them to start there." There was a pause, then her voice dropped. "Maggie, be careful." By the time I reached Blackwater Lake, the fog was lifting off the water, revealing the old wooden dock stretching into the still surface. Thomas was already there, standing at the far end with his hands in his pockets, looking out across the water like a man admiring a view he owned. When he turned to face me, the smile was faint. "You came. You threatened my sister," I replied. "Of course I came." He gestured to a bench halfway down the dock. "Let's talk." I stayed where I was. "You first. Where's Elaine?" "She's fine," he said smoothly. "For now. But that depends on you." I pulled the tote bag a little closer to my side. "You mean these documents? The ones that show exactly how you've positioned yourself to take everything from my father the second he's gone?" He didn't flinch. "Business is business, Margaret. Your father understands that. What he doesn't understand is how dangerous it is when people start digging where they don't belong." I let out a short laugh. "Dangerous for who? You? Or the people who've already tried to stand up to you?" He stepped closer, his voice low. "You're too old to play these games." That was his mistake. Thinking age meant weakness. I took a step forward, my hand slipping into my cardigan pocket, thumb pressing the recorder's button. "Here's the thing, Thomas," I said clearly. "I don't scare easily. And I don't meet people like you without leaving a trail. Right now, everything we're saying is being recorded, and my friend has instructions to send it to the police if I don't check in by noon." For the first time, his eyes flickered. "And," I added, "this conversation, it's being streamed to a cloud account my nephew set up for me. You can't touch it." He stared at me for a long moment before his lips curved into something between admiration and contempt. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for." Before I could reply, a figure appeared at the far end of the dock, Elaine. Her hair was messy, her expression pale, but she was walking under her own power. Thomas stepped aside just enough for me to see her fully. "She's free to go," he said, "if you hand me the originals." Elaine's voice trembled. "Don't give them to him, Maggie." The choice was clear. Give him the papers and risk him walking away with the power to destroy Dad's company. Or refuse, and put Elaine in real danger right there on the dock. I reached into my tote, my fingers brushing the crisp edges of the documents. And that's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel behind me. The footsteps came faster, steady, deliberate. Thomas's eyes darted over my shoulder, his confident posture stiffening. I turned just as Gloria stepped into view. Only she wasn't alone. Beside her was a uniformed county sheriff, his hand resting lightly on his holster. "Maggie," Gloria called, her voice calm but firm, "you can put those papers away. I think we've got what we need." Thomas's face didn't move, but I saw the tension in his jaw. "What is this?" The sheriff stopped a few feet from us. "Thomas Avery, you're under investigation for multiple counts of fraud, coercion, and intimidation. We've also got new evidence tying you to a suspicious death. You'll need to come with us." For a moment, the only sound was the soft slap of water against the dock. "That's ridiculous," Thomas said, his voice smooth but thinner now. "You have no—" "Actually we do," Gloria interrupted. She lifted her phone, pressing the screen. From the small speaker came Thomas's voice, clear, cold, threatening me, admitting to manipulating Dad, implying what might happen to Elaine. My own voice followed on the recording, sharp and unshaking. "Right now, everything we're saying is being recorded, and my friend has instructions to send it to the police if I don't check in by noon." The sheriff took a step closer. "We've also got a witness statement from your late wife's sister. Seems she's been waiting a long time for someone to listen." Thomas's gaze flicked to Elaine, who stood frozen, pale as the fog that still clung to the far bank of the lake. "You think you've won," he said to me, his voice low. "But people like me don't just disappear." I met his stare evenly. "No. But they do get outnumbered." The sheriff cuffed him without another word, reading him his rights as he walked him back down the dock. Elaine stayed still until they were almost to the gravel lot. Then she looked at me, her eyes glassy. "I didn't know it would get this bad," she whispered. "It started months ago, before Dad even thought about introducing you. I tried to end it, but he knew things about me. Things that could have destroyed me." I took a slow breath, my anger still there but muted now. "We'll deal with that later. Right now we make sure Dad never signs anything with him again." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. By the time we got back to town, word had already started to spread. Small communities have a way of carrying news faster than the wind. Dad called me before I could call him. "I don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "I thought he was my friend." "I know, Dad," I said gently. "But people like Thomas, friendship is just another transaction to them." There was a long pause. "You saved me, Maggie." And in that moment I felt the years between us shrink, not as father and daughter, but as two people who had both been fooled and both been spared worse. A week later I stood in my garden, pruning the last of the autumn roses. Elaine came by with coffee, her eyes clearer than I'd seen in months. She set the mug on the porch railing. "Thomas is gone for good," she said quietly. "Gloria told me the DA's building a strong case. He won't see daylight for a long time." I clipped a thorny stem and dropped it into the bin. "Good. That's exactly where he belongs." We stood in silence for a while, the air crisp, the smell of damp earth all around us. Finally Elaine spoke again. "You know, you could have walked away. You could have let me deal with it." I met her eyes. "That's not what sisters do. Sometimes survival isn't about fighting harder. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to call in allies. And sometimes the sharpest weapon you can have is the truth, spoken out loud for the right people to hear." Thomas Avery thought age made me weak. But 82 years had made me patient. And patience is what brought him down. The morning after Thomas's arrest, I thought I'd finally sleep in peace. But at 6:13 a.m., a pounding on my front door yanked me out of bed. It wasn't Gloria. It wasn't Elaine. It was my father. "Maggie, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the living room. He looked older than I'd ever seen him. His hair mussed, eyes red, and his usually crisp dress shirt wrinkled like he'd slept in it. "Dad, what's wrong?" He ran a hand through his hair. "Thomas called me from jail last night." I stiffened. "And what did he say?" "That you've been trying to ruin him because you're jealous of your sister. That you've been feeding the police lies." His eyes searched mine. "Is that true?" The words hit harder than I expected. "Dad, you saw the documents. You heard the recording Gloria played. This isn't about jealousy. It's about him trying to steal everything from you." But my father wasn't looking at me like the daughter he'd trusted his whole life. He was looking at me like a stranger. "He says the partnership clause was my idea. That I asked him to step in because I didn't think either of you girls could handle the business." That stung. "Is that true?" He looked away. I thought you weren't interested. You have your quiet life." "Elaine, well, she seemed more willing." My throat tightened. "Dad, she was willing because she was sleeping with him." His head snapped back toward me. "Elaine told me it was nothing. That you were reading into things because you don't like her choices." "Dad." But before I could finish, my phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number again. "You think it's over? Check the mailbox." I walked out to the curb, Dad trailing behind me. Inside the rusted metal box was a manila envelope with my name scrawled across the front. I opened it right there, the cold wind snapping at the corners of the paper. Inside was a single photograph. Grainy, black and white, clearly taken from a distance. It was of Elaine, standing outside a downtown law office, talking to a man I didn't recognize. handing him an envelope thick enough to be full of cash. On the back, written in bold black marker, "Your sister was never just a victim." I handed it to Dad without a word. His hands shook as he stared at it. What is this supposed to mean?" he whispered. "It means," I said slowly, "that Elaine might have been playing both sides. And Thomas might not have been her only partner in all this." Dad sank onto the porch step, the photograph dangling from his fingers. I stared out at the quiet street, the hairs on my neck prickling. Thomas Avery might have been in jail, but someone else was still moving the pieces. And if I didn't figure out who, everything we just fought for could still be lost. I didn't wait. By noon I was downtown, standing in front of the same law office from the photograph. The December wind bit through my cardigan, but I barely felt it. My focus was on the glass door, the gold lettering that read Whitman and Cole Attorneys at Law. Inside, the reception area was warm and smelled faintly of coffee. A young woman behind the desk looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see whoever Elaine Prescott met with last week," I said. Her smile tightened. "I'm sorry, but we don't." "Tell them it's Margaret Prescott," I cut in, letting the weight in my voice do the rest. 10 minutes later, a tall man in a charcoal suit appeared. His handshake was firm, his expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Prescott, I'm Alan Cole. Let's step into my office." The moment the door shut, I laid the photograph on his desk. "I'm not here for games, Mr. Cole. My sister was here. She gave you something. I want to know what it was." He leaned back in his chair. "Confidentiality." "Don't," I said sharply. "This is about my father's estate, his company, and the man currently sitting in jail for fraud. If you think I won't drag you into this, you're wrong." He studied me for a moment, then sighed. "Your sister approached me to draft an agreement. She wanted to sell her future share of Prescott Holdings, your father's company, to a third party. The buyer's name." He opened a file and slid it toward me. Froze. The buyer was listed as Avery and Prescott Properties. The signature on the agreement was dated 2 weeks before Thomas had ever met me. By the time I left his office, my hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the realization that Elaine hadn't just been caught up in Thomas's schemes. She had initiated one of them. She had been ready to sell out the company, and me, long before Thomas even became Dad's business partner. That evening I drove straight to her townhouse. She opened the door in sweatpants, her hair pulled back, eyes wide. "Maggie." I shoved the file into her hands. "Tell me this isn't yours." Her face drained of color. It's not what it looks like." "It looks," I said, my voice trembling, "like you were ready to hand over Dad's company for cash before Thomas ever stepped into our lives. And then you got in bed with him, literally, and almost handed him the rest." She gripped the doorframe, her voice breaking. "I was drowning in debt. Thomas promised he could fix it. I didn't know he'd." "You didn't care what he'd do," I snapped. "You cared about getting out of your mess, even if it meant burning down everything our family built." Tears slid down her cheeks. "You don't understand." "You're right," I said coldly. "I don't. But Dad will." That night, I sat with my father at his kitchen table and told him everything. The photograph, the agreement, the date on the signature. He listened in silence, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. When I finished, he closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. "I can forgive mistakes," he said finally. "But betrayal, not from my own child." It wasn't anger in his voice. It was something worse. Resignation. A week later, the papers were filed. Elaine was removed from the will, her name struck from the company's succession plan. Dad appointed me as sole trustee of the Prescott estate. It wasn't the victory I'd imagined. It was hollow, tinged with grief. On Christmas Eve, I sat in my garden, watching the frost glisten on the rose bushes, when Gloria stopped by. "You did what you had to do," she said gently. I nodded, my throat tight. Thomas was a storm. But Elaine, She was the crack in the foundation. Sometimes the hardest part of survival isn't defeating the enemy. It's realizing the enemy might be wearing your family's face. And when that happens, you don't just protect what's yours. You rebuild it stronger. Even if you have to do it alone. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any stranger's knife. But tell me, which wound would hurt you more? A charming outsider who tries to steal everything you've built, or your own flesh and blood selling you out for cash? I want to know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next one will make you question just how well you really know the people closest to you.